that lived during the Carboniferous, and the strange green trunked plants, and the odd lizards and whatnot that lived in the Carboniferous. But I think it's another thing to actually imagine lying down in a forest like that and looking up at the canopy. And so one of the things that I want to emphasize today is how art and science really can synergize. So my goals today is kind of outline my personal journey to this particular exhibit. Some of the things that happened to me individually in my journey, but everybody's journey is different. And so we'll talk about how things can happen that way as well. I'd like to show how art serves science, and how science in turn inspires art as well. I'd like to talk about the special role of imaginative fiction, in other words, science fiction and sometimes fantasy, for inspiring scientists. And I'd like to urge all the students who have checked in to follow your dreams. And sometimes in the process, you'll find that you have to remake them, but that's fine too. So I'll just kind of take a look at the art which is in the exhibit, just so that you're familiar with what's there. One piece is called Metamorphosis, and it is science fictional in nature. I kind of imagined a time a million years in the future when maybe our civilization had gone by the wayside, but there were still human beings around, and some aliens came to Earth that thought we were kind of adorable pets. And so that kind of started the production of this particular illustration, and ultimately led to the book, A Once Dead Genius in the Kennel of Master Mortigue Ambergrand, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. Another piece of art is the Mother Tree Forest. And this piece of art was created in conjunction with a sequel to that first book that I mentioned, A Twice Dead Genius Comporting with Misunderstood Abominations. And interestingly enough, I actually modified the original artwork, which didn't have the figures in the foreground, but when I used it for a book cover, I added those in Photoshop, then decided that I needed to come back and change the original art. And the third piece of art in the exhibit is called Slime Mold Diaspora, and this is a more traditional kind of scientific illustration. Now, it's a little hard to tell just from looking, but I don't know how many people in the audience are familiar with slime molds. I'll tell a little slime mold story a little later, but basically these are single-celled fungal critters, and the illustration, of course, gets a little up close and personal in showing what this might look like from a slime mold's point of view. So let's do a little bit of time traveling here. If you were to go back in time, back into the 1950s and go to the great state of Michigan, you might have found this small nerd child wandering around in the city of Battle Creek, Michigan. And most likely he was looking for a science fiction book, because I got interested in science fiction very early. One of the authors that I found was Isaac Asimov. And as you can tell from the price of this paperback, 25 cents, this was a long time ago. And it has kind of a, what shall I say, bombastic cover here with this guy in strange outfit. But the story itself was very compelling, because it told of a future in which the human race had spread across the galaxy among 100 billion stars, and this civilization was flourishing until suddenly it was in decline. And the fellow pictured on the cover of this book is supposed to be Harry Seldon, who was a psychohistorian. And he came up with this 1,000-year plan to save the empire from going into 10,000 years of chaos. So anyway, this preoccupation with deep time and deep space was fascinating to a young version of myself. This is a scratchboard illustration that I did of Isaac Asimov. He was quite a character himself. He had a PhD in chemistry, but he was especially interested in writing science fiction. Although even though he was writing about future times and places, turns out he was afraid to fly. So we all have our idiosyncrasies. So my love of nature continued. This is a little later version of me as a college graduate from the University of Michigan. I decided to study biology because I wasn't quite sure what to do with my interest in art. But I figured if I studied biology, heck, I might become a teacher, which is what I did. My interest in nature goes a long way back. This particular illustration I call a milkweed universe. And it really illustrates the point that if you take the time just to sit down in nature in front of any plant, for example, pretty soon a wealth of creatures will come out and show themselves. And that's one of the fascinations of biology. I'd also like to tell you a little slime mold story. I don't know how many of you are familiar with slime molds, but they're pretty amazing creatures. I was sitting in class, a Botany 101 class, and the first teacher that I had for the class was, I have to admit, a little bit boring. The lectures were a little slow and tedious. But one day that fellow disappeared and in walked a guy in a white lab coat, kind of a balding gentleman by the name of Dr. Sussman. And he went up to the podium and he started talking about the chemistry of water. And this was in a large auditorium at the time full of students. And one student finally stood up and said, is this Botany 101? And Dr. Sussman said, well, yes, it is. But I'm talking about the chemistry of water because it's so critical to life. Anyway, it turns out that Dr. Sussman, one of the creatures that fascinated him the most was the slime mold. And the interesting thing about the slime mold is for most of its lifetime, it's a single cell that meanders about the bottom of a forest floor, happily munching on bacteria. But when the bacteria disappear, the food supply diminishes. It sends out this signal, chemical signal. And suddenly all these cells will begin to come toward each other. And eventually they'll fuse into this kind of giant blob. And the cells will begin to differentiate. And they'll form a stalk. And the stalk will eventually form those little black bean-like structures on the top that are sporangia. And inside the sporangia will be spores. The spores will dry out, release the sporangia, and they'll take root, hopefully somewhere where they can become a new amoeba, just wandering around eating bacteria. And so this slime mold creature fascinated me from a very early part of my career. Ultimately, of course, leading to a slightly different illustration of a slime mold that's in the current exhibit. So I had a desire to share my love of nature with other students. Came out to Colorado after I graduated from college and taught biology in a small town called Akron, Colorado. I enjoyed teaching to a certain extent, although some students, of course, can be rather trying. I also met my wife about this time, who was the PE teacher, so I promptly married her. And I decided that I wanted to kind of expand and do more artwork. I also decided that my experience as a teacher, I wanted to do a little bit more writing. And I ended up doing some more formal scientific writing for the American Biology Teacher and other magazines. And this was a good way to sort of combine my interest in science and art because I did a lot of the illustrations for the pieces. Pill bugs also became a fascination. So I wrote a pill bug biology, spider spinach, but a biologist's delight. Lichens are also amazing critters, a fusion between algae and fungi. And again, it's fun to imagine, for example, the world of a pill bug, in which something like that spider, which you see attacking the pill bug in the foreground, would be quite a monstrous thing to have to contend with day to day. But it turns out that those disgerid spiders can overcome a pill bug's defenses and get their lunch that way. It was about this time that I became aware of the existence of a group called the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, or GNSI. And this is a group of people who are very fascinated with science, but they are primarily artists, and their goal is to really illustrate what some people have a hard time imagining, some of the aspects of science. So their mission is to connect professionals to promote, educate, and celebrate the communication of science. A lot of opportunities that you can have in GNSI. There are educational workshops, both in person and online. They have annual conferences. They have art exhibits. They have a great newsletter that comes out monthly. And they also, in 1968, began this Journal of Natural Science Illustration, which is now a quarterly publication, but it allows artists to become familiar with the techniques of other artists, and how they illustrate scientific principles and so on. So if you want to, one of the other benefits of the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators is they do also offer a place to have your portfolio. And Britt Griswold, who is a longtime member, started this science-art.com. And for a pretty reasonable fee, about $190 a year, you can post your portfolio there. And I've had several leads over the years from people who have seen art in that particular location. The national site is www.gnsi.org, and they also have Facebook and Twitter accounts. So it's a great organization for artists with an interest in science. And, the kind of art varies across the board: illustration, animation. I know Boya apparently has quite a bit of experience in animation, which is something I never really got into, but that's great. Some people are into comics, museum exhibits, photography, printmaking, kind of runs the gamut. Now, when I left teaching, I still need to pay the bills, and I had considered at one time the possibility of maybe going back to school and getting specialized degrees in scientific illustration. But instead, I made connections with a actually a printing company in Fort Collins, Colorado, Citizen Printing Company. And so I found a job there and learned a lot about the practical side of the printing business, and also how to become a graphic artist. While I was working there, and I did work at that job for 27 years, a long time, but I also pursued my interest in writing more about science, and doing things that would be of interest to science teachers and also to students. One book that was many years in the making was called Dinosaurs in the Garden. And I had this project in the hands of agents for a while. One agent retired, so I took it on myself. I found a publisher in Florida who was interested in the book, but he was looking for a project that I could complete within a year. And at that point, I still had quite a bit of the manuscript to do. Finished the manuscript, submitted it. Then that publisher decided that he was going to retire, and the book moved on to a publisher in New Jersey, Plexus Publications. But ultimately, Dinosaurs of the Garden came out in 1988. And it was about the time that scientists were first learning that birds were actually direct descendants of dinosaurs. And so that's kind of where the title of this piece came from. But one of the nice things that while I was working as a graphic artist at this printing company, one of the processes that they developed was called a split fountain technique. And the color in the background is all created with one printing plate, but they allow the colors to merge as the paper is run through the press. And so you can get this interesting blending effect. And so the white in the illustration was knocked out of this split fountain, and then the black was overprinted. And anyway, it was fairly unique at the time. So the piece that I did for the cover eventually ended up in Illustrators 30, which came out in 1988. And also, while I was at Citizens, I wrote a book called Explorations in Backyard Biology. The idea here was to write something that teachers could use as a resource, but I also started out each section with a short article similar to some that I had been selling to Highlights for Children magazine, so that students could get kind of an overview of a topic, but then go out in the field and actually do some actual sketching. One organization that I came in contact with at that time was the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And this is another organization which is great both for prospective writers and also for illustrators, especially illustrators of children's books. Their mission is to support the creation and availability of quality children's books. And this is an international organization. It did actually start in two places, in Denver, Colorado, close to where I am, and also in California. And those two chapters were the chapters who were kind of the nucleus around the organization developed. And ultimately, the chapter out in California became the headquarters. However, I was a co-regional advisor for the Rocky Mountain chapter from about 2000 to 2003. Again, great opportunities with SCBWI. They do annual conferences. They will also, if you're a member, try to connect you up with writers groups that are in your area. And this is really the best way to learn how to write effective manuscripts, is to get in a group with other people that are roughly at your level, critique each other, and really learn the craft. But also, once you have made connections with publishers, maybe through a conference, and have had the opportunity to publishing something, then you also have some speaking opportunities that you can pursue as a member of the group. And I did quite a bit with the way of school visits early on in my career. Also, of course, great artist networking with the artists that join the group. So the national group is scbwi.org. And I noticed that Connecticut belongs to the New England chapter. And so I've got the website for them up here, newengland.scbwi.org. Now, when I moved out to Colorado, I was able to pursue another interest in addition to my interest in science fiction, and that was an interest in fossils. And Colorado is an excellent place for fossil hunting because it's a place where erosion is king, you might say, and there's a lot of exposed land where fossils are eroding out. So I ended up joining a group called the Western Interior Paleontology Society, which is mercifully abbreviated as WIPS, W-I-P-S. And their website, which I didn't put up here, I see, but that's www.westernpaleo.org. During the summer, they have a lot of great field trips. And one that I've gone on for many years is to a place called Bacolite Mesa. And the fossil that you see on the left, there's actually two fossils here. On the top, there's that coiled critter, which is a kind of mollusk. It's a type of ammonite, specifically a scaphite. And it was kind of nestled among some long rod-shaped fossils called bacolites. And those kinds of fossil finds were very exciting. Now, one of the trips I went on was actually out to western or eastern Utah to collect some fossils for a new museum that they were putting up out there. And by this time I was kind of middle-aged, and you can see that a middle-aged nerd has quite a distinctive look to them. And it turned out that there was another artist on the that knew Kirk Johnson, who was then the director of the Natural History Museum at the Denver Museum, called Ray Troll. And he eventually got a hold of that picture along with another one. And when Kirk Johnson and Ray Troll wrote a book about fossils, I ended up as being an example of a middle-aged paleo nerd who is still in love with dinosaurs. So sometimes nerds can suffer from this pianist syndrome. However, on all my studies with fossils and going on these field trips with the Western Interior Paleontological Society ultimately resulted in the publication of a book called The Deep Time Diaries. And this was a book for kids, or at least I wanted kids to find it and be interested in it. And an editor that I had at the time named Suzanne Barchers was very instrumental in helping me focus to get this book something that would be of interest to kids. I wrote it from the viewpoint of two kids, John and Nisha Oliphey, who were writing diary entries. And John and Nisha lived in our future, but they had a family which found this ancient alien artifact, 800 million years old, that was in orbit around the Earth and the moon in one of the stable areas, the Lagrange points. And they inadvertently found a time machine there that whisked them back 800 million years into the past. And so the story involved them traveling back through time. And during that process, and having lots of adventures, of course, they also learned an awful lot about fossils. So this led to actually using the Deep Time Diaries in some classrooms. I found an excellent teacher in Wellington, Colorado, Vicki Jordan, who was a teacher for my daughters when they were young. And she was very interested when this book came out from Fulcrum Publication. And so she worked on curriculum that incorporated the Deep Time Diaries into some of the geology lessons that she was doing. And I would go in once a year as a visiting author and talk about the process of writing, for example, your own journals so that students could create their own Deep Time Diaries, and also telling them something about the nature of fossils, how they're formed, and so on. While I was creating the book, I had the opportunity to do the illustrations. Many of the interior illustrations were simple pencil sketches that were presumably done by the father of this little family that traveled back in deep time. But there were also more detailed color illustrations that sort of were used to introduce each major section. So, for example, when they traveled back to Pleistocene times, 20,000 years ago, they met this saber-toothed cat named Gimp, who had a bad paw, but he was able to still make a living by eating critters that fell prey to the La Brea tar pits out in California. The beginning of another chapter talked about the Eocene in Wyoming. And 55 million years ago, Wyoming was actually a tropical paradise. Go figure on that. But there were some giant birds, 6 foot tall, that stalked some of these forests. And there's one lurking in the background there, looking very hungrily at one of our distant ancestors in the foreground, a lemur-like primate. Going back even further into the Cretaceous, I illustrated a dinosaur called Gallimimus. And one of the things I like to point out when I was talking to students was that artists many times have to take their best guess when they're illustrating the past. They have to base what they draw on the fossils that are known at the time. And when this illustration was created, no one had actually found a skull of Gallimimus. So if I were redoing this today, when they did find a skull of Gallimimus, they found that it was actually a filter feeding dinosaur and the teeth were very distinctive. And so I would probably have to show this critter, if I were redoing it today, kind of as a shore type dinosaur that was a fisher. And so it's good to point out to students that the process of being a scientific illustrator, just like the process of being a scientist, depends on new data that comes in. Another illustration illustrated some of the floods that deposited fossils near the area of Dinosaur National Monument in northwestern Colorado and into Utah. I thought the perspective looking down on this flood from the top of a tree was kind of a cool idea. Going even farther back, 300 million years into the past, again, this is a Carboniferous forest from a different perspective than the first slide that I showed you, showing a lycopod tree trunk. Some of the insects back at this time actually got to be 6 foot long, and the critter in the back, Simoria, is actually an animal that had some characteristics of both amphibians and reptiles. Going farther back to the Cambrian, the dawn of actually complex life, the critter, which is under the shadow of that kind of menacing predator in the foreground, is a trilobite. And the critter itself, with the eyes on stalks, is a critter called Anomalocaris, which was the largest predator of the day, although only about 3 foot long. And even further back to the Ediacaran fauna of 700 million years ago. And this is where the time travelers eventually ended up and had to try to find their way back from there. And of course, I won't tell you how that story ends in case you might want to read that book. Another point to make, though, is that illustrations that you create from one project can be used on another. After quite a long time after the Deep Time Diaries came out, this illustration, the rights to use it was purchased by a museum in Arizona and was used in one of their fossil displays down there. Vicki Jordan and I, and also an English teacher that helped during the time that we were working on curriculum, we wrote an article for Science Scope, which is the NSTA journal for middle school science teachers. And that resulted in some additional sales of the book and so on. We also gave talks at various NSTA conferences over the years. So that was a fun endeavor. Now, one of the things that really led me into the whole area of combining my interest in science fiction and art was the fact that the middle of the 20th century really expanded the universe in an amazing way. It's hard to imagine, but until 1924, astronomers, when they looked up into the sky, basically thought that all the stars that we could see up there, and only the ones that you can see only amount to, say, 5,000 or 6,000, We knew, however, that there were billions of stars that could be seen by magnification, but astronomers thought that that's pretty much all there was. And there were some fuzzy areas in the night sky that astronomers thought perhaps were kind of clouds of dust. But when they were looked at through more higher powered telescopes, and when they found objects in those nebula, such as Cepheid variable stars that were very similar to much closer Cepheid variable stars in our own galaxy, all of a sudden, astronomers became aware of the fact that many of those fuzzy spots were actually entire other island universes out there. And kind of in one swoop, it expanded what we understood to be the extent of the universe. Once scientists made that breakthrough, it didn't take long before writers began to kind of exploit this discovery and try to explore some of the ramifications of that. And one of the writers that came along about this time was a fellow named Olaf Stapleton. And he wrote what is usually described as a novel, although it isn't quite like some of the science fiction novels that we look at today. And yet in some ways he explored topics that were explored in more detail during the rest of the 20th century. The premise of The Star Maker is that an Englishman goes out onto his back lawn one night, and while he's observing the stars, he somehow magically is able to rise up into the sky and suddenly travel through all these immensities. And he takes this amazing journey that takes him from one star system to the next, and eventually from one galaxy to the next. He meets intelligent creatures of all shapes and sizes, and it's an amazing sweep of the imagination, which inspired a lot of science fiction writers that came afterward. So of course, art is a very strong tool to explain science, and you can use it in a number of ways. You can explain science to kids. You can popularize science and explain it for adults. You can write nonfiction titles that can be used in the classroom. And so during the 80s and so on, I did quite a bit of this. I wrote a number of articles for Highlights for Children. Spider Talk was one, telling how jumping spiders actually communicate by waving their legs back and forth and dancing in just a certain way. In fact, if males don't dance in just the right way, the larger female will eat them rather than mate with them. So it's good that they learn quickly. Also wrote some articles for Cricket magazine, one in particular on lichens. Did some writing for Discovery Channel books, worked for higher projects where I got a chance to do some very imaginative writing, which was used in middle school classrooms. And I also wrote and still write for a magazine called Colorado Gardener magazine. And this is mostly for adults, but it's a way to write short pieces to show people some of the things that they can find in their gardens if they take the time to look properly. Also had a chance to do some writing for Chelsea House. They did a series for the Franklin Institute that was part of a geology series called The Restless Earth Fossils. That was a lot of fun to write. And so over the years, I ended up doing a number of both nonfiction books and also some short fiction. I belonged to a writers group in Denver where I learned the craft of writing short fiction. Of course, all of us have different sources of inspiration, and I'd like to mention three kind of briefly. One is a fellow named Loren Eiseley, who born in 1907, lived till 1977. Some of you may be familiar with him, not necessarily as a scientist, although he was a scientist, an archaeologist, but he was an elegant writer and a poet. And so he wrote a number of books in the 60s and 70s that were simply worth writing for the elegance of the language. One such book was called The Invisible Pyramid. And this was a book about evolution on life on Earth. And he used the metaphor of a returning comet, specifically Halley's Comet, that makes a cycle around the sun, as you may know, every 76 years. And he wondered what visions Halley's Comet saw on a changing Earth as it came around every 76 years. He tells an interesting story at the beginning of the book where his father, now Halley's Comet came around in 1910. Loren was born in 1907. He was just 4 years old at the time, but he tells a story where his father takes him outside while Halley's Comet's in the night sky of Nebraska, and he holds him up and he whispers in his son's ear that I'm not going to be around the next time this comet comes around, but you may live to see it. And then in the rest of the book, Eiseley wonders what that comet saw before it came around in its trip in 1910. What wonders did it see? And so that gives him an opportunity to talk about biology and evolution. One line that I really liked in this is, he says, at 4, I had been fixed with the compulsive vertigo of vast distance and even more endless time. And I think that's one of the things that fascinates paleo illustrators in particular. Loren Eiseley also later became known for a scientific discovery he made in northern Colorado. He was a young graduate student in 1935 when he got invited to an archaeological dig in northern Colorado. And while there, he made a very seminal discovery. The object in the foreground is the vertebrae of an extinct bison antiquus that lived at the end of the last ice age. And Loren, as a graduate student, was given the grunt work of cleaning this fossil off. But in the process, he found one of the fulcrum points of this culture that lived at this time in northern Colorado was actually embedded in the bone of bison antiquus. So if that were the case, then Native Americans had been on this continent for 10,000 years as opposed to the 3,000 years that they thought at the time. Loren Eiseley also wrote another book called The Innocent Assassins. As a graduate student, he had made an amazing discovery in the Dakotas of 2 saber-toothed cats that had died in mortal combat, and the sabers of one tooth had been embedded in the scapula of another. And so a line from the beginning of the book wonders why these amazing predators didn't survive while man, the wide-ranging assassin that he is, managed to survive to the present day. So some of the things that Eiseley wrote were, you might say a little on the downer side. He had a little bit downer opinion of human beings, but his writing was really elegant, and I would recommend his writings to anyone. Another source of inspiration, especially for illustrators, is Charles R. Knight. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Charles R. Knight's name, but many of you probably have seen his illustrations at one point or another. This is a illustration I did of Charles Knight based on a 1914 photograph. He was, Charles Knight was actually a wildlife illustrator and a graphic artist. And he had been fascinated by animals for his entire life. And it turned out that his father worked for James Pierpont Morgan, who was connected with the American Museum of Natural History. So Knight had the opportunity to spend many Sundays alone in the museum while his dad was talking to his employer. And so he kind of haunted the Natural History Museum, and he was noticed by a Dr. Wertman, who was doing some work on fossil pigs. And he invited Charles into his office one day and wondered if Charles might be interested in trying to reconstruct what this animal looked like. Charles said yes, and the rest is kind of history, because Charles Knight got very interested in paleontology. And he met Edward Cope, who was a paleontologist well known in the 19th century, and was able to be inspired by some of his work. And Charles R. Knight went on to create some books that were well known in the 40s and 50s. This is one, Life Through the Ages. Later in his career, he was commissioned to do 28 murals for the Chicago Museum. And many of the images from those murals you saw in a lot of books about dinosaurs during the 50s and 60s. In fact, I remember doing a field trip as a junior high kid to the Chicago Museum and being amazed by his work. He also, Charles Knight, became a writer later in his career, wrote a book for Illustrators showing how he did some of his drawings from life in the zoo and so on. This is an example. And in 2005, one of his daughters published a previously unpublished autobiography of Charles R. Knight. So if you get a chance, take a look at Charles R. Knight. Pretty amazing. And by the way, he had severe astigmatism, so he was legally blind, and yet he was still able to do this amazing work. Another source of inspiration is a woman named Lynn Margulis. And she was a practicing biologist when I was going to school. She was a woman biologist, which already made her suspect because of the kind of sexism of the day. She had to be more assertive and more intelligent than a lot of her colleagues in order to get her ideas proposed. And she came up with a radical idea, which is now mainstream. But the idea that multicellular organisms like you and I are not made of one kind of cell, but rather we're a chimera of human cells mixed in with the cells of microorganisms like bacteria and viruses. And in fact, for every 10 human cells, or for every 10 cells in the human body, 8 or 9 of them belong to microbes, bacteria and viruses of one kind, and only one is characteristically human. Also, she discovered that some of the organelles, the tiny structures within human cells and other multicellular organisms, were actually at one time free-living organisms. For example, the energy organ, the mitochondria that appears in cells of all multicellular creatures, has its own independent DNA. And ultimately, this DNA was shown to be similar to some free-living bacteria that apparently made up residence at one point a very long time ago and ultimately became a critical component. Anyway, the paper that she wrote had a hard time getting published. She sent it to 12 publishers who rejected it before it was finally published. Ultimately, she wrote a book with another woman by the name of Schwartz called The Five Kingdoms, which described the 5 major living groups on planet Earth and emphasized the importance of microorganisms in this whole situation. The illustration that I created here from Scratchboard, the part on the right is based on a photograph of Lynn Margulis at a conference. The part on the left is a redrawing of an image that was created by her son Dorian. And by the way, Lynn Margulis was married to Carl Sagan, an astronomer who was a popularist during the 60s and 70s. And her son Dorian was a pretty accomplished artist, and he worked with his mother on a number of projects. This illustration on the left was one I created called the Aeolian Zone. And it illustrates the fact that every breath that you take, you are inhaling maybe 1,500 bacterial cells, hundreds of fungal cells, and a nice assortment of pollen and other things. So the atmosphere of the Earth is actually almost like the circulatory system of our planet, and it transports tiny arthropods like that spider in the center, along with pollen and bacteria and viruses from one spot in the world to the other. Cool stuff. Another thing that is sort of a result of much of Margulis's work is the fact that we now know that forests are actually an interconnected biological entity that are connected by a network of fungal cells. And one of the main things that came out of a lot of Margulis's work was that life did not take over the world by combat, but by a kind of networking. So it's a very kind of positive outlook, I think, for biology. And that ended up, influencing scientific works like Avatar. You'll maybe recognize some of the similarities. And it also influenced some of the science fiction works that I ultimately came up with. In fact, the first science fiction novel that I wrote was a book called A Singular Prophecy. And this turned out to be a project with a very long gestation period. I was learning the process of writing a novel at the time, and so put it through numerous workshops and writers groups. Ultimately, I probably spent 10 years on this particular project. The first cover that I came up with for the book was kind of a photo montage of several things. The background is actually the location of a fossil hunting site in Colorado near the town of McCoy, where you can find fossils. In the foreground is an actual fossil of a mosasaur vertebrae. And then I also took a picture of a hand, which is in the foreground, and found a picture of a silver sphere, did some Photoshop magic and so on. And the premise of this first book is that a young paleontologist makes what he thinks is the discovery of his lifetime when he finds this unique mosasaur skeleton. But embedded within the bones of the mosasaur skeleton is this sphere. And when he touches it, he's infected by an alien personality that first visited Earth 72 million years prior. And so it was a entertaining book to write from a person with an interest in science fiction and paleontology. And of course, for a biologist, creating aliens can be a very fun exercise. And for this particular book, I envisioned an alien race called Grovians, who went through an alternating of generations where they had a haploid generation that looked a little bit like centaurs up in the top, that only had a single set of chromosomes. And when they mated, they produced a seed which grew into a diploid generation, which was actually a giant tree-like structure. And that tree-like structure ultimately formed pods, which gave rise to the mobile haploid generation. And that was the generation which interacted or could interact with human beings. And in the diagram there, you can see how big a human being is compared to these Grovians. Of course, the problem is integrating plot, characters, and science so that you have this sense of wonder. This was the ultimate cover for A Singular Prophecy, in which I illustrate a mother tree on the right near the end of time, and there's a couple of characters in the book on the left. So if the plot sounds of interest to you, I urge you to take a peek at A Singular Prophecy. I kind of found my voice in writing science fiction with the Once Dead Genius book. I'll tell you a very quick story about my English teacher back in the day, whose name was Mrs. Limpus. And she didn't like science fiction very much. She thought that, that it wasn't very good literature for the most part. Her husband did like it, so she was kind of conflicted. And she told me one time that, you know, if you're going to write science fiction, you ought to write science fiction like Kurt Vonnegut Jr. did. Science fiction like Player Piano, for example, which kind of told social truths of some deep kind with an ironic twist. But when I was the kind of science fiction that I had grown up with as a kid, I thought that writing this sort of social commentary stuff was almost an insult to science fiction in some way. So at the time, I didn't think much of it. But when I wrote A Once Dead Genius, I found out that the voice that I ended up choosing for that particular book had a lot in common with some of the stuff that Kurt Vonnegut did. One of the things about science fiction is that, or especially in the early days, it wasn't taken seriously as literature. And I saw a description one time of the difference between ah, yes stories versus oh, my tales. And science fiction really is a kind of oh, my tales. A lot of times, especially in the earliest science fiction, it was the novelty of the scientific concept that was being described that was supposed to startle the reader. And sometimes the characterization sort of fell by the wayside. Whereas in real literature, quote unquote, as a reader, you were supposed to come to some sort of an epiphany where you would say, ah, yes, this is the way it really is. Now, in fact, much of the science fiction that was written during the late 60s and 70s and 80s, and much of it also written by writers, that women writers that came into the field, is now quite excellent. And so in addition to imagining future worlds and bizarre aliens, quite often the literature is also excellent as well. So here again is the painting Metamorphosis. And for this particular book, I envisioned a different alien species, one that shared certain characteristics with, for example, creatures like butterflies, where the organism went through a series of, well, first of all, the eggs hatched in water, and then there were larval forms which grew and competed with each other until eventually they crawled out onto dry land as a tripod larva and went through a series of molts which could last up to 800 years. And this was basically the adult stage of this alien species. They never had sex, for example, until after their very final molt, maybe 800 years into their life cycle. And after this final molt, they would find a mate, breed, and then die pretty quickly. So the premise of the story was that I had this scientist who finds himself, his mind trapped in the body of an artificial intelligence, and he ends up in the distant future and ultimately forms a kind of merger with an adult form of one of these aliens. And at the end of my talk today, I'll give you a short reading from that, give you a little better idea of what's going on in that story. Again, here's the cover for A Once Dead Genius in the Kennel of Master Montague Ambergrand. The dead genius rose once again, however, with the next book that I wrote, and that was the Twice Dead Genius book. And unexpectedly, when I was writing this book, I decided that I could probably make this a trilogy with the first book that I wrote. That turned out to be a little more difficult project than I originally thought, but it was fun in the end. And so I combined in A Twice Dead Genius, comporting with misunderstood abominations, the Grovian creatures that I had invented for the Singular Prophecy, along with the Jatterbadian creatures that I had invented for A Once Dead Genius. So what I'd like to do now, since I've been babbling on here for about an hour or so, I would love to see if you guys have any questions about anything I've talked about so far, and have the opportunity to take a little break with questions before I actually do a short reading for you. So can I leave my screen shared while we do this, or would it be better not to?
I think you can probably put us on or leave your screen share, Gary, so that we can have an opportunity to see who's asking questions or speaking.
All right. All right. Do we have any questions out there?
Yeah, I can ask a question, Gary. Just off the top of your head, since we're in an academic situation, what kind of processes did you go through as far as your basic education as an artist? How did that transpire, and what form did that take?
Yeah, I have to admit that as far as art's concerned, I'm pretty much self-taught in that regard. I went to school for the biology, but as far back as elementary school, I was drawing cowboy hats on my capital letters, and I was drawing comic books of superheroes of the day like Superman, and some of the Westerns like Hopalong Cassidy. So I was constantly drawing. I did take a mail order art course when I was a younger kid, and got some instruction that way. But for the most part, I taught myself the techniques. I did when I moved to Colorado, I did some work for a natural science illustrator who was working for Colorado State University. And I worked together with him a little bit. And so that was kind of useful too. So I guess one point I'd make is that there are kind of many roads to Rome, and depending on your inclinations and your skills and whatnot, you can approach this from a couple of different directions.
Thank you.
Let's see. I think if someone could take a look at the chat and read those for me, that would be great. I'll admit that if it looks like I'm squinting at you, you're right, because I had cataract surgery recently and I still haven't got my final glasses. So I'm having trouble seeing some of the things on here, but
I'll be happy to read those for you, Gary, if you don't
all right.
mind. Okay, from Elizabeth Cowles, biology professor here. Slime molds are closely related to amoebas.
They are an amoeba-like critter, yeah, and they are usually not in the group Protoctista, but they're usually considered a fungal kind of critter. But there is some interesting chimeric things going on at this level. But I know that I don't know how many of you that are in biology are familiar with Carolina Biological Supply, but when I was teaching, you could actually order dried slime mold plasmodia, and they would come dried out and in a little cylinder, and then you could put them on moist filter paper or some other substrate like agar, add a little bit of water, and the cells would rehydrate. And you could see this plasmodium, which was kind of the collective individual cells that come together just before they create the stalk and everything. So they're pretty cool critter.
And the next thing is that for me, I was fascinated with the, we'll go back to the slime molds and biology. I think it's interesting that, is this an analogy or closely related to the concept that, these multicellular creatures, including us, originated as these sort of separate entities or colonies that, kind of hung out together and then became so symbiotic that, they became an entire much more complex organism, animal or plant.
Yeah, both the some of the internal organelles within cells were probably once free living. I mentioned mitochondria, also flagella sometimes are considered to be once free living bacteria and so on. So you've got that aspect of it. And then even when you get your multicellular organism made up of the individual cells, then in addition to that, you also have a host of other bacteria and viruses which sort of integrate their DNA and their skills along with the specifically human cells. And of course, the big example for that is like in the human gut, where, for example, E. coli cells create some of the vitamin K that we no longer can create ourselves. So human beings are actually kind of a microbial high rise, you might say.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, quite a bit of our physical weight, our total population of cells, including our own, are largely foreign organisms. And even in the gut itself, there's the biome, that this sort of microscopic world that's actually inhabited, that we actually require them in order to live.
Yeah, cool stuff.
Ethan Brusso has a question about, what was your inspiration behind the creature you created in your Twice Dead Genius book?
Yeah, in the Twice Dead Genius book, it was the idea that, I had the Grovians, which I had originally designed for my Singular Prophecy book. And I was able to integrate them in the story or in the future timeline for the Once Dead Genius book. So the Jatterbatian organism. So I had Jatterbatians and Grovians. And what was the question then? How did I integrate those, or how did I come
Well,
up with?
what was your inspiration behind the creatures?
Oh, well, kind of as a biologist, I was trying to figure out some kind of an organism for the Once Dead Genius book that would be live long enough so that human lifespans would seem kind of short in comparison, and then one that would have enough of a difference in terms of their biology that I could come up with some sort of humorous interactions and so on. So I thought the whole idea of kind of a moth-like critter that was very large, grew up on a planet with slightly less gravity, but was not completely invertebrate either, had an internal skeleton, but still went through this kind of a metamorphosis life cycle where it went through several molts during the course of most of its life. And then it didn't finally finish its life cycle until after it went through that final molt.
So you're basing these creatures essentially on a sort of an amalgam of present organisms that we encounter daily. They don't have these lifespans per se, but nevertheless, this sort of biology, you kind of pick and choose or borrow from various classifications of creatures.
Right. I mean, I think one of the limitations that we have as human beings is that, of course, we only right now know of only one planet that has life. And so in some ways, our imagination is a little bit limited by what we know about Earth life. But for example, I don't know how many people here are fans of some of the Star Trek universe or all that, but one of the episodes in the early Star Trek series was postulating life forms built on the element silicon, and they had the Horta.
Sort of rock-like creatures.
Right. But when you actually look at the possibilities and you look at the frequency of different chemicals and things in the universe, it's probably pretty likely that most of the life we're apt to encounter is probably going to be carbon-based in some form or other. And then it becomes a question of, how did the special characteristics of a certain time and place kind of mold the creatures that ended up developing. And so as a biologist, you kind of look at what the examples that we have on Earth and let your imagination roam a bit and see what you can come up with. So that's kind of what I did.
I think that's a good segue into the idea of, well, there's life and then there's intelligent life. And, how does that intelligent life actually conduct itself? Porpoises, for instance, are very intelligent creatures, but they didn't develop these complex civilizations, mainly because they really have no reason to use that intelligence in any other way than they do at the present. They're quite happy.
All right. And some of your audience may be familiar with the Drake equation that was developed back when Carl Sagan was doing a lot of his work with Ozma and looking for intelligent life in the universe. And one of the factors, the Drake equation is kind of a rough equation where you multiply, the probability of the number of stars in the universe and the number of stars that have planets and the number of planets that would be in the sweet spot for life and this and that and the other thing. One of the factors in that equation too is how long would a civilization such as what human beings have developed actually survive? Because if it turns out to be a short flash in the pan, then your chances of meeting some other intelligent life is very small. But if, for example, we can hang around for 1 million years, maybe we have a better shot at maybe encountering some other intelligent civilization, which has also lasted that long.
Good luck.
Yeah,
We could be just missing each other, kind of late for the universal Zoom meeting.
right. So I see that Judith says that Kirk Johnson's a friend of yours. That's cool.
Hang on. Am I off mute?
Yeah. no,
Yeah, he's a good friend of ours. We up at Stone Rose, we actually kind of credit him and Wes Ware for finding us
Ah,
the fossil deposit. Yeah, he was 17.
yeah, exactly. Well, he's told us that story before. It's a neat story. And of course, when he came to Denver, he really built the prehistoric journey exhibit there. And
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah, and we've visited with Ray Troll quite a few times too.
oh, cool. Yeah,
So I'm glad to meet the paleo nerd that inspired the PNS.
well, good.
But I really encourage anybody interested in fossils to come up and see our fossil site. We have like what's considered one of the top 5 Eocene fossil sites in the world.
Really? And
Yeah.
where's that at exactly?
It's in north central Washington state. It's in Republic, Washington.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it's right now there's we've had quite a few paleontologists publish papers off of our collection, and right now there's a big one that just kind of hit the press up in Canada. A paleoentomologist actually identified a new family of Odonata.
Uh-huh.
Oh,
So, and I'll have to brag a little bit. He and my son and I worked together with the tribal elders, and they gave him the word for the family. So we're pretty excited about that. They're getting a press release ready to that effect.
so what was the wingspan like on that organism?
They're more like normal sized Odonata. The huge ones that you were talking about are actually kind of a different species.
Yeah,
It's it's a predecessor really, but
right.
so these are more normal. And what we find up there, because the fossils were formed by volcanic ash, and so a lot of the soft body parts are missing. Not always, but so far with most of the Odonata, what we find are wings. But it's totally identifiable by wings. That's what you identify them with. So
Yeah, very unique. Yeah, one of the cool things about the Carboniferous critters was that the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere was so much higher than maybe 30 parts per million instead of 20 or whatever, or 30% rather than 20%. And so that may have had something to do with the size some of these critters got to, but yeah.
Oh yeah, they think it definitely did. So, but
Their respiratory.
But anyway, my youngest son kind of grew up fossil digging, and so right now he's a grad student down at ASU, but in about a year he has plans to intern at the Smithsonian because Kirk Johnson wants him there. So
yeah, Kirk, unfortunately, he was involved, well, fortunately for him, but he was involved with the snowmass excavation there west of Denver. And so he got a lot of national attention from the Smithsonian and other places when they came out. They saw what a tremendous communicator he was, and they snatched him up.
Yeah, well, we're pretty proud of that, but because we kind of claim him.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, but my youngest son's kind of claim to fame is he's Native American. He's an enrolled member of the Colville tribe.
Oh.
And which almost, we have never found another paleontologist that's actually Native American so far. So we're hoping our life goal was to inspire other Native American children to understand that science is for them too.
Yeah, cool.
Gary, I have a question. So what would your advice be for our art students who want to pursue a career in scientific illustration? Because they might be scared away from the idea as they don't have a lot of understanding in science. I mean, they take some courses because we're a liberal arts institution, but in general, their knowledge in science is very limited. So what would you, your advice be for them to kind of get inspiration or get the proper education they need to pursue a career?
Well, I think one good option might be actually to join the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, or at least kind of cruise around their site a little bit. One of the opportunities that you have when you join GNSI is that there's a listserv where illustrators that are actually doing work can ask each other questions and network and all that kind of stuff. And I think that gives you an opportunity to meet other people who are doing similar things. And I know that some people in GNSI come from a scientific background like I do, but I think others come more from an art background, and you'll see a broad range. I think one of the characteristics of scientific illustrators is they tend to be people that really like to do the detail work, but they also have a lot of imagination for creating unique perspectives on what's going on. But I think being a member of GNSI and doing some of that networking is really important. It's similar to the process that I went through in learning how to write. I didn't take any writing courses in college either, but when I got to Colorado, I joined a writers group. It was actually run by a fellow named Ed Bryant, who was a writer that originally came from Wyoming and formed a group down in Denver. A bunch of people who were interested in writing science fiction, and so they would write and critique each other every month. And that was a way to learn the craft. And similarly with SCBWI, they have an illustrators group, and they form sort of their own workshop groups. And that is a good way to trade techniques and that sort of thing as well.
Great, thank you.
You bet. All right, any questions we didn't get to? All right, are people ready to dive into a Once Dead Genius for a short reading?
Yeah.
All right, let's do that. Let's see if I can share my screen again here. All right, let me give you a little setup for this. This reading that I'm going to do is from chapter 5. And what happens in a Once Dead Genius is that there's this genius named Rudyard Albert Goldstein. And at the beginning of the book, he's on his deathbed. He had created this amazing mathematical equation called the biomic network algorithm, which supposedly had become famous because it had allowed people to survive some of the ecological catastrophes of the 21st and 22nd centuries. And anyway, Rudy was resigned to die, but he was being tended to by a friend, a doctor, and the doctor had other ideas. The doctor thought that he could find a way to preserve Rudy's consciousness as part of an artificial intelligence, which was called Mnemosyne, although later on Rudy had trouble pronouncing Mnemosyne, so he called her Nessie for short. And at any rate, Rudy was dead against this, but when he died, the good doctor stole his brain engrams and inserted them into this artificial intelligence so that Rudy could help mankind into the distant future. So by chapter 5, this integration had already happened, and Rudy and Demosthenes had existed together for a number of decades. But then a disaster struck. And so this chapter will begin with that. Let's see here. Okay. So chapter 5, Ground Zero. Rudy, we have a situation. Don't we always? Rudy found himself on what looked like the bridge of some Hollywood starship set. He was strapped into a plush padded chair with Demosthenes resting her virtual cheeks in a similar chair on his right. A potentially fatal situation. Note the speck on the screen I've just flagged with an arrow. What is it? An asteroid, one with roughly the mass of Mount Everest, on a collision course with Earth. Like the one that gave dinosaurs a really bad day 66 million years ago? Yes, that one. In combination with accelerated volcanic activity in what is now India, destroyed perhaps 75% of the complex life forms on Earth at the time. That is a bad day. How much time do we have? 13 days, 6 hours, plus or minus 18 minutes. What can we do? What assets do we control? Demosthenes pushed some areas on a touchpad, and a bulleted list appeared on the screen. Rudy noticed an assortment of items from nuclear weapons to materials consuming nanobots to mining lasers and more. What's our best shot, Rudy asked. Has any government or other agency ever worked out strategies for such an event? Heaven knows Hollywood worked on all kinds of scenarios. I'm not encouraged by the time frame we have available, the efficiency of human governments, or the imagination of Hollywood, Demosthenes said. Explosives would just multiply. Let's see here. The number of projectiles. The object is too close to deflect at this point. Perhaps if we could launch one of the Chinese booster rockets with enough properly programmed self-replicating nanobots, we could reduce the asteroid to a cloud of small debris, but that would still likely turn the atmosphere into something resembling a broiler oven. We've got to try. I've gotten used to living in this little brain box heaven you built. Rudy fingered his virtual seat harness and stared at the screen. I agree that we must try, Demosthenes said. And thank you for the compliment. I enjoy your company as well. She looked at him with what appeared to be limpid eyes. Rudy decided she was getting better and better at mimicking human mannerisms. I will also act discreetly so as not to reveal that I am manipulating political and economic decisions, although that might be a moot point at this juncture. They tried valiantly, to no avail. The Chinese consortium launched 3 booster rockets with appropriate nanobots. One rocket exploded in its launch bay, but the other 2 arrived at their destination. By that time, however, the nanobots had a hopeless task. Even if fully 20% of them hadn't had a fatal programming error, probably the result of utilizing cheap labor to minimize cost overruns. The surviving bots did chew up 10% of the asteroid's mass, creating a rather attractive halo of debris when sunlight struck it from just the right angle. 13 days, 6 hours, and 12 minutes from the time God's hammer, a term coined by a young media evangelist, came to the world's attention, approximately 1 trillion tons of asteroid struck the upper atmosphere at 18 miles per second, 60,000 miles per hour. Rudy and Demosthenes watched visual feeds from atmospheric drones placed at strategically safe distance from immediate destruction. The impact of the asteroid with the atmosphere turned a pleasant summer evening centered off the coast of Australia, a few kilometers from the town of Mackay, into an artificial midday. During its first 4-second traverse of the atmosphere, the asteroid appeared like the sun in free fall, only 4 times brighter. Then it struck the ocean's surface. My God, Nessie, it looks like some horrible volcanic tumor, Rudy's voice trailed off. The explosion? An apt descriptive metaphor. It represents hundreds of billions of tons of vaporized rock and seawater, Nemazny said. You can almost feel the air burning, clouds shattering in bloody contrails. The shock wave is expanding at 29 kilometers per second. The crater is widening rapidly through bedrock. It's currently at 63.4 kilometers and increasing. Look at that molten pillar rising into the sky. Rudy felt like an insect transfixed by a flame. It has been 10 seconds since impact, Nemazny noted. A plume of debris has risen above the atmosphere and will begin orbiting the Earth, at least some of it. Particles re-entering the atmosphere will heat the atmosphere like a broiler oven at first. Eventually, the orbiting debris will induce massive global cooling as it blocks sunlight. Carbonates and sulfates vaporized during the impact will convert to greenhouse gases and a sulfuric acid rain. Rudy watched without comment as post-impact sludge returned to Earth. Burning mountains of rock and mud that once was fish and coral and 100,000 people and tons of Mackay sugarcane sleeting down into a cauldron of boiling seawater. Rudy closed his eyes, but Nessie's programming algorithms were too precise. He still saw after images of hell for seconds and seemed to stretch for an eternity after his virtual eyelids had sealed shut. Finally, he did hear Nessie's voice. It seemed to have an element of tenderness to it, but that could have been his imagination. I have some good news and some bad news, she said. Good news? Relative to what? Rudy asked. Relative to planetary annihilation, Nemazny replied. The human race will survive in numbers that should prevent their complete extinction. No mean feat under the circumstances. And, Nemazny continued, the impact site is almost half the planet away from us. Although we will still suffer tremendous weather extremes over a century or more, my geothermal power sources and manufacturing infrastructure should survive. I will, however, have a lot of work to do because of the bad news, which is human civilization is, or soon will be, completely destroyed, along with any hope for rebuilding it in the foreseeable future. The remnants of the species will be feral for a while. A while? Rudy decided to open his eyes against his own better judgment. He still sat on the Starship bridge. The photographic drones had retreated further from ground zero. The pillar of ejecta and rain of debris from the impact looked rather majestic in a maelstromy kind of way, especially in the low angle light from a sun struggling to peek through everything. He wondered if the last dinosaur had had this kind of view of her own destruction. A while, in this case, could be as long as 1,000,000 years. Variables include the increased risk of disastrous chance events in earthbound populations that will be small and scattered, and whether or not the modest human colonies on Mars and the Moon can come to the aid of their home planet. I'm calculating long odds on the latter. Rudy tried to imagine 1,000,000 years, but his mind flagged at the prospect. The digit 1, trailing a string of zeros, strangled our little simian brain like a thief's garrote, he thought. Shit, 1,000,000 years is 4 times longer than the entire time it took for us to change from a slightly bemused ape with a flint tool to a totally confused ape with an iPod. Actual time may vary. This event has no historical precedent. So what's next? Some kind of virtual hemlock? Ah, an oblique reference to the trial of Socrates in 399 BC. But unlike Socrates, we have not made impious comments to students by failing to acknowledge certain gods. Nemazny ponytailed avatar looked at him with saucer eyes, like some befuddled college freshman. But we must have angered a few gods somewhere, Rudy said. Anyway, the point is, I don't think even I can find enough to amuse myself for 1,000,000 years. And there won't be any adoring crowds to fawn over whatever brilliant thoughts I might have. I see your point. Humans, even gifted ones like you, need other humans in fairly large and adoring numbers. Rest for a time, Rudy. Let me get back to you. I have a lot to attend to. Rudy rested. At least that is how Nemazny referred to the arrested state in which she kept Rudy's neural patterns, when her own circuits were preoccupied. Sometimes she conversed with Rudy's subconscious network to pass the time. Sometimes she explored the unique dream/reality complexes that Rudy had constructed over a lifetime. Human fantasy life seemed irrelevant and exotic, except that somehow it made them the creative organic creatures they were. How strange, how alien. Finally, Namazini felt the need to recreate Rudy's conscious gestalt once again. My, a lot of time had passed. This one little diagram that I've thrown up here, this was a data file page in the copy of the book. And this kind of shows you a little bit about the lifespan of our own sun on the left-hand side. So that timeline goes from 0 to about an estimated lifetime of 12 billion years. You'll note down toward the middle, between 4 and 5, I've got a note about the reader's present day, which is when we all exist, of course. The dark gray area just to the right of that represents the geological time scale as we now understand it, which goes from the origin of complex life 500 million years ago in the Cambrian, all the way to the present day. The lighter gray block just above that represents probably the amount of time we have left that the Earth will be habitable. And everything above that, our Earth sun will begin expanding and eventually kind of fry us off the face of the planet, and eventually will ultimately be destroyed. But anyway, we have at least another couple of billion years to solve some of our problems here on Earth. So this is just kind of a little device to give you a little cosmic perspective. And let's revisit the goals that we started out with. You've seen my journey, and of course now it's time to create your own. I hope I've shown a little bit of how art serves science and how science can really ignite art as well. Imaginative fiction, like science fiction, can inspire a new generation of scientists. We know that a lot of the early science fiction writers were inspired by the work of Goddard, the rocket scientist, and a lot of the scientists who ultimately became NASA scientists were inspired by the science fiction they read as kids. I would urge all of you to follow your dreams and modify them when necessary. And I'm sure really appreciative of you listening to me this morning, and be happy to entertain any other questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and see if anyone else has some additional questions after that reading. I see someone in the chat room has mentioned that they're the president of the New England chapter of GNSI. So looks like there's quite an opportunity for you to get a little bit more information to someone who knows there.
Gary, I have another question.
Sure.
How did you publish your first book? Like, how did you make that connection? How did you get that book deal? Because understanding the publishing industry is getting more and more difficult nowadays. So I'm just interested in hearing your story and what your advice might be for students who might want to go into publishing one day. Thank you.
Yes, it's quite a process. My first book, Dinosaurs in the Garden, was traditionally published. And I believe I may have briefly mentioned that I did have it in the hands of an agent for a while. And she sent my preliminary proposal and sample chapters around to a number of places. Got a few nibbles, didn't get any solid bites. Then that agent decided to retire. And so the manuscript came back to me. I found a listing of a publisher in Florida called Flora and Fauna Publications in an issue of Writer's Digest magazine, which is a magazine that's still published, I think, both in digital and hardcover forms. I proposed the idea to him. He liked the idea, but wanted me to get back to him when I thought I could complete the whole project in a year's time, which I did. So I completed the entire manuscript, did a lot of the illustrations, got back to him, got signed a contract with him, thought that was well on the way to getting published, and then he decided to retire. And he sold the book to Plexus Publications in New York, and ultimately they ended up publishing that. So as you can see, like the traditional publishing route can be a long, complicated process. That book was published that way. Explorations in Backyard Biology was another traditionally published book. Didn't take nearly as long. I actually met my editor at a Society of Children's Book Writer and Illustrator meeting in Denver. She liked my writing style, wanted me to submit something. So I had the idea for the Deep Time Diaries, submitted the idea to her, signed a contract. And by this time I was in my late 40s and I was working for Citizen Printing. It was my third book project. And it was then that I decided to kind of embark on a freelance career. And most of the income from the freelance career was coming from doing freelance biological illustration for a person in Fort Collins who was doing work for illustration work for scientific publishers mostly. But the book contract for the Deep Time Diaries I sold to Fulcrum Publishing. I did get an advance both for the manuscript and for the illustrations, so it was kind of a double advance. But again, it was traditionally published, so it's a royalty deal where you only get money once a year from your royalties. And the advance is very modest, a couple $1,000s. And so traditional publishing can have issues if you want to be an income earning writer. My contacts with SCBWI allowed me to meet a lot of writers in that organization, and many of them were nonfiction writers. So during a lot of the 1990s, I found writing projects where I was doing work for hire, where you were paid a flat fee for writing a book of a certain length. And that fee was often more than you could get from a royalty book altogether. So like, for example, writing a 40,000 word book for Chelsea publishers might earn you, say, $5,000, and it might take you 3 months to write or whatever. Likewise, you could write for various other things like Discovery Channel books and whatnot. Well, eventually, when I got down to the point where I wanted to write a novel, I was getting a little long in the tooth, as they say, a little older. And I didn't want to go through this long, complicated publishing process of trying to locate a publisher and have it published and whatnot. And so I started to take advantage of the self-publishing opportunities available out there. And so I published A Singular Prophecy as a KDP Amazon book. And because I had the background in graphic arts, I was able to lay out and design my own book, do my own cover art and whatnot, which is a way to avoid having to pay a lot of those fees that you might otherwise have to outsource. And you don't have to have a lot of books that are sitting in your garage because you only have to pay for what you buy individually. Of course, then you also have to get involved into marketing and design. So there's that aspect of it. But all three novels of mine were basically self-published, although the Penstemon publication imprint that you see on the books was actually one that we created for my entire writers group that I was working with at the time. And if you visit Penstemon Publications, you'll see that we've actually published well over a dozen books now, many of them award-winning. And we basically did that as kind of a small working writers group and publishing entities. So to make a long story shorter, there are many more options now than there used to be, but depending on the route you take and your personal proclivities, you may have to get involved with more marketing and advertising if you go the self-publishing route than if you are able to work with existing publishers. Does that help at all, or
Oh, yeah.
confuse you?
Thank you for the valuable information.
Sure.